Hello everyone. Welcome back to Mr. Darkvale. Tonight it's 11 more true trucking stories, sent in by the people who actually live on these highways after dark. Solo drivers, husband and wife teams, even a dispatcher who rode out an entire crisis over the radio. These accounts don't come from strangers swapping tall tales. They come from the cab. And every one of them was too specific, too consistent, too unsettling to dismiss. We dug into what could be verified: police reports, radio transcripts, rest stop incident logs, and the pattern held up every time. In this episode, a pair of headlights that refused to fall back for 200 straight miles. A woman's voice looping the same impossible mile marker on Channel 19. And a hitchhiker who's simply gone from a cab that never opened its doors. If you've spent a night alone behind the wheel, some of this is going to sit with you. Hit subscribe. Turn the bell on. This channel isn't chasing jump scares. It's built on slow-burning authentic horror. And if the road's ever given you something you can't explain, tell us below. Your story may be the next one we uncover. Now cut your dash lights, settle in, and let's go. We don't call it a ghost story. We call it a warning. And there's a difference. A ghost story you tell once and let die. This one we've kept alive on purpose, passed driver to driver for going on 50 years now, because somebody coming up behind us on that stretch needs to hear it before they see it for themselves. If you've run I-94 through eastern Montana long enough, past Miles City, out where the exits get 30, 40 miles apart, and the only light for hours is your own high beams bouncing off sagebrush, you already know the shorthand. Somebody keys up on Channel 19, voice flat, like they're reporting a deer carcass in the median, and says something like, "Copy, I got the flatbed back here. No chicken lights, coming up past Kinsey," and whoever's listening doesn't ask what he means. They just say 10-4, watch your mirrors, and that's the whole exchange. A rookie riding along the first time hears that and thinks it's a joke, some hazing thing for new drivers, until he asks an old hand what it actually means, and watches the old hand's face not laugh. The first telling most of us go back to is Dale Kessler's. And Dale's been retired almost 15 years now, but he still tells it the same way every time. Which is the thing about Dale's version that keeps people believing it. This was 1988, hauling grain out of Forsyth, deep winter, that low gray Montana overcast that sits on the land like a lid. Dale said a flatbed came up on him fast. No headlights, no marker lights, nothing. And he only knew it was there because of the sound. A bad tandem. A hitch in the axle rotation you could feel through your own trailer before you could see the truck it belonged to. It went around him on the left, load strapped down under a tarp he couldn't make out the shape of, and pulled back into his lane maybe 400 yards ahead. Dale said he watched his own headlights catch the back of that flatbed for maybe 8 seconds. Then it wasn't there. No side road. No section line for 11 more miles in either direction. He checked later, on paper, because it bothered him enough to check. What makes it a story, instead of just Dale's story, is what happened about a year and a half after, when a driver who went by Whistler on the radio was hauling steel coil out of Billings and got passed the same way. Same busted rhythm in the axle, same dark shape, same stretch of road, and Whistler didn't know Dale or Dale's account at all. They met at the town pump in Miles City by coincidence, swapping complaints about the same dispatcher, and Whistler mentioned it sideways. Embarrassed, the way you mention something you think makes you sound unstable. Dale just set his coffee down and said, "Chain dragging on the left side. Little rattle to it?" Whistler hadn't said anything about a chain. That's the detail that traveled after that, not the lights. The chain. It kept happening to people who had no reason to compare notes, which is really the whole engine of why this is still a story anybody tells. A few years on, 2 drivers pulled into the same truck stop outside Glendive within 20 minutes of each other and got to talking the way you do at 3 in the morning with nothing else to do, and worked out that they'd both seen it that same night, both times just past Kinsey, but 40-some miles apart from each other, within about 10 minutes of each other on the clock. One flatbed can't be in 2 places at once going opposite directions. That's not folklore. That's just math. And it's the point where a few of the old-timers stopped treating it as one truck that spooked people and started treating it as something else. something they didn't have better language for than the CB code they'd already started using. The detail that turned it from a story you told to a story people started digging into came from a driver named Renata Voss, who ran refrigerated freight through there for almost 2 decades and doesn't scare easy, by her own account or anyone else's. She got close enough one night, tucked right up on its tail longer than anyone else claimed to have managed, close enough to make out lettering on the door, before the gap between them opened up faster than her own speed could account for. She got a company name, partial, but real letters, not a shape she was guessing at. Rourke and something. Sons, maybe. That's when it stopped being ours alone and started being something you could put in front of a courthouse clerk. A guy Renata knew, who ran a title company on the side, started pulling old business filings for her, mostly as a favor, mostly not expecting to find anything. He found Rourke and Sons Trucking, registered out of Miles City, dissolved in 1974. One truck on the books at closure. The filing gave a reason for dissolution that the clerk's office still had on microfiche. Settlement of a wrongful death claim. The death, once somebody bothered to pull the old newspaper on it, belonged to a driver named Harold Denard, 31 years old, who'd been hauling structural steel for Rourke and Sons on a run into Miles City on a January night in 1971. The paper said his lighting circuit had shorted somewhere west of Terry. What the paper didn't say, but what an old highway patrolman's widow told Renata years later over coffee, because her husband had worked the scene and never fully let it go, was that Harold Denard didn't pull over. He kept driving blacked out for close to 20 more miles, in the dark, in the cold, trying to make it to town, rather than lose the load, and the night's pay calling it in. He went off at a bridge rail, 3 miles past where anybody thought a man could safely manage that in the dark, and it took the crew until morning to find him, because nobody driving past in the night saw a thing to report. No lights to see. That's the part where a few people quit calling it a story and started calling it something they'd rather not name outright. Because if you already knew that history, an account that came later hits different. A driver named Petrick, running nights out of Glendive in the early 2000s, radioed in shaking, said the flatbed had answered him. He'd keyed up half joking, said something like, "You got a copy, driver," not expecting anything. And something came back on his channel, low, broken up, and said his given name, not his handle, his actual first name, the one on his CDL, the one nobody on that channel that night had any way of knowing. Not everyone who dug into it wanted the answer to be something you couldn't explain. There were people who dug for a plainer reason, and for a while, they had a fair case. A dispatcher who used to work the Rourke and Sons account, tracked down by a trucker doing his own amateur digging in the 2000s, said the final manifest on Denard's load never fully reconciled. Steel went out heavier on paper than what got delivered, and nobody chased it hard, because the family was already suing, and the company folded before an audit ever finished. That's not a haunting. That's a company covering its own mess, with a dead man's name already doing the covering for them. The court file, when somebody finally got a look at the parts that weren't sealed, showed the settlement came with a confidentiality clause and an altered set of hours of service logs that put Denard on the road 2 hours longer than his paperwork admitted, which is the kind of thing companies did quietly then and still get caught doing now. By the time dashcams got cheap enough that every third truck had one zip tied to the dash, a fair number of us figured that would settle it, one way or the other. It didn't. A driver named Osei, hauling out of the Bakken during the boom, caught what he swore in real time was a flatbed running dark, right there in his mirrors, close enough he flinched. Footage showed empty highway, not blurred, not glitched, just nothing where he'd have sworn on his kids something had been. That unsettled people more than a clear photograph ever could have, because it meant whatever this was, it wasn't shy of cameras. It just wasn't the kind of thing a camera catches, which is around when the skeptics got their strongest foothold, and for a while, a lot of us leaned that way too, because the explanation fit the world we actually work in. Running dark on purpose is a known move for people moving something they don't want. Logged, stolen trailers, cloned VINs, freight that isn't supposed to exist on paper. A state trooper who used to work that corridor said as much to a trucking podcast a few years back, off the record mostly, that a flatbed running blacked out at night was exactly the profile of a real live person exploiting an old legend nobody wanted to investigate too hard, using the fear as better cover than any tarp. And it lined up with an actual FMCSA regional bulletin that made the rounds in trucker Facebook groups, warning about a cloned plate theft ring, working stolen equipment through exactly that part of eastern Montana. For a while, that was almost a relief. A criminal is a problem you can call in. A criminal doesn't keep you up. One driver took that theory seriously enough to actually chase it, a guy who ran a small trucking safety channel online, cross-referencing sighting dates against stolen trailer reports, building out a whole theory thread that got picked up and shared a few hundred times. He said he was close to something, then he stopped posting. Not dramatically. No goodbye post. No explanation. His channel just went quiet. And when people asked around, the people who knew him personally said he'd sold his truck and gotten out of the business altogether and didn't want to talk about why. Some of us figured he just burned out, the way a lot of guys do chasing something too hard for too long. Some of us didn't figure that at all. The part that pulled all of it back together and pulled it closer to home than any of us were ready for came through a younger driver named Cody Denard, who started running the Miles City routes for a regional carrier a few years back, in his mid-20s, new enough to the road that he still asked a lot of questions on the radio. He didn't know the story yet when he started, and he sure didn't put together, the first few times someone mentioned it, that Denard wasn't a common enough name for it to be a coincidence. His own grandfather. He'd grown up knowing his grandpa died in a truck wreck before his dad was even old enough to remember him, but nobody had ever told him where, and nobody in the family talked about the how of it. Cody's own account, when he finally told it, came almost a year after he learned the family connection, on a run past Kinsey in the dead of winter, and it's the one that quieted a CB channel full of grown men who'd heard every version of this thing already. He said his throat went tight before his brain caught up to why, because that exact pattern was a signal his grandmother used to tell him about, something his grandfather used to flash from the ridge road above their place when he was still working local runs, before the long-haul jobs, to let her know he was almost home. Cody had never told anybody that detail in his life. His grandmother was the only person who'd ever known it, and she'd been gone herself for 6 years by then. That's the one that broke the clean theory a lot of us had gotten comfortable with. A thief running stolen freight under cover of an old legend doesn't know a dead man's private signal to his wife. That's not a detail you clone off a stolen VIN. A group of us, close to a dozen trucks, organized a run through there together this past fall, mostly out of the same restlessness that gets a person digging in the first place, wanting to either put it down for good or finally have something solid to hand the next rookie, besides a story. We ran in formation, GPS trackers pinging every driver's position to a shared app, dash cams running, FRS radios as backup to the CB. Somewhere past the Kinsey turnoff, for about 90 seconds, 3 of the trucks lost their GPS ping entirely. No error, just a gap in the data afterward, like those 3 vehicles hadn't existed for a minute and a half. 2 of those 3 drivers reported seeing the flatbed, clear as anything, in that same window. The other truck in that gap saw nothing. The 9 trucks outside that gap saw nothing either. We came out the other side, with less agreement than we went in with, not more, which is its own kind of unsettling, because the whole comfort of this story being told by so many separate people for so many years was that it kept lining up. That night it didn't. Cody wasn't on that run. He'd stopped taking that route himself not long before, quietly, the way people do, when they've decided something without wanting to explain the decision out loud. Then this past February, running a load he'd picked up almost as a favor, short-handed carrier, one route, he went through that stretch anyway. His last check-in ping showed him 9 miles past Kinsey at 2:14 in the morning. His next scheduled ping, 20 minutes later, didn't come. His dispatcher started calling. Nothing. It was another 40 minutes before anyone reached him, and when they did, he was pulled over on the shoulder near Fallon, engine running, hazards on, completely fine by every measure that matters. No accident, no injury. He couldn't account for where he'd been for those 40 minutes. His ELD showed the gap as engine idle, stationary, a location that didn't match either end of his actual route. He told his dispatcher he didn't remember stopping. He's still driving. Some of us have talked to him since, and he doesn't say much about it beyond confirming the timeline holds, that the log doesn't lie about the gap even if he can't fill it in. He runs other corridors now. Somebody else runs that freight lane through Miles City these days, and whoever it is, sooner or later, they hear the same thing the rest of us heard starting out. Somebody keys up on Channel 19 on a clear, cold night with nothing on the road but their own high beams, and says, "Copy. I got the flatbed back here. No chicken lights. Coming up past Kinsey." And whoever's listening doesn't ask what it means. They just say, 10-4, watch your mirrors, and drive on. Because that's the whole job, out here. You keep your hands on the wheel, you keep the story moving to the next set of ears, and you don't look too long in the mirror when something's running dark behind you. I've put more hours on US 2 than I can count. That stretch of highway locals call the High Line, cutting across the top of Montana, where the towns are 40, 50 miles apart, and the radio stations disappear into static somewhere past Chinook. I hauled equipment for a living, tractors mostly, occasionally a skid steer or a baler, and January runs were nothing special to me. I liked the night stretches, actually. Less traffic, less to think about except the white line and the heater fighting the cold coming through the door seal. This one started out like every other one. I'd left Shelby a little after midnight, planning to make Glasgow by sunrise, gas up somewhere around Malta, keep pushing east. Clear night, hard cold, the kind where the snow squeaks under your boots if you get out, and your breath hangs in front of your face for a second before it's gone. I had the radio on low, coffee in the console, nothing on my mind but the road. Somewhere past Chester, I picked up a set of headlights behind me. Didn't think a thing of it. People drive this road at all hours. Ranchers, truckers, oil guys, coming off shift. I watched them in the mirror out of habit more than concern, the way you'd watch anything moving in an otherwise empty world. They stayed back a good ways, maybe a quarter mile, hard to say exactly at night, with nothing to measure against, but the mile markers ticking by. I didn't think about them again until close to Havre, when I realized they were still there. Same distance, same pace, like they were tied to my bumper with a rope that never went slack and never pulled tight. I sped up, bumped from 60 to 70, 75, watched the speedometer needle lean right, and waited for the gap to open up. It didn't. I slowed down after that, dropped to 50, then 40, telling myself if he came around now, I'd feel stupid for even noticing, and that would be fine. That would be the best outcome. He didn't come around. The gap held. Same quarter mile, like it had been measured out with a tape. Past Havre, the land opens up in a way that's hard to describe if you haven't seen it. No trees, barely any rise or fall to the ground, just flat white, going out to a black sky, with more stars in it than a person knows what to do with. There's nowhere for a car to hide out there, and nowhere for it to need to. It was just him, and me, and about 400 miles of nothing between the two of us, and anybody else awake. I got to Milk River Fuel a little after 2, right around where I'd planned to stop anyway. It's a gas station, and a little attached diner counter, open all night for the exact kind of driver I was. I pulled in under the lights, half expecting him to pull in right behind me, and for a second I was almost looking forward to it, because at least then I'd see a face, see it was just a guy, maybe somebody heading the same way, who liked to keep his distance out of habit same as anybody. He didn't pull in. The lights held at the edge of the lot, out past where the plowed snow made a berm along the shoulder, and then they were gone. Not turned off, just gone, like he'd kept driving straight through without slowing, which didn't square with the mirror I'd been watching every 10 seconds for 200 miles. I went inside anyway, filled up, bought coffee, and asked the kid behind the counter, half joking, if he'd seen the car that had been sitting behind me. He looked at me like I'd asked him something in another language, and said there hadn't been anybody through since a beat truck around 11. I told him no. This was somebody who'd been on my tail since past Chester. Had to have come through here one way or another, since there's nowhere else to go on this road. He shrugged and told me I could look at the lot myself if I didn't believe him. I did look. The snow had come down steady since maybe midnight. Not much. An inch or so, but enough to hold a print clean. My own tracks were right there, cutting in off the highway and curling around to the pumps. Sharp-edged, fresh. There wasn't another set anywhere. Not near the pumps. Not out on the shoulder. Not merging in from the highway behind mine. If another vehicle had been on that road in the last 3 hours, it would have had to leave a mark somewhere in that snow, and there wasn't one. I stood out there longer than I should have in that cold, running it over, trying to make it make sense the boring way. Maybe he'd turned off earlier than I thought, and I'd only imagined the mirror still showing something. Maybe the wind had smoothed his tracks and not mine, though there wasn't enough wind that night to smooth anything. I got back in the truck telling myself it didn't matter, that whatever it was behind me now. Gone. And I had 200 more miles and a job to finish. About 40 minutes past the station, still short of Malta, I did something I don't usually do, which was pull off onto one of the section line roads that cut north off the highway toward the river bottoms. A gravel track I only knew because I'd hauled a header off a farm out there 2 summers before. No reason for anybody to be on it in January. No reason for anybody to be behind me on it at all, unless they were following me specifically, and not just running the same road east. I wanted to know which one it was. I made the turn slow, watched the mirror the whole time. The lights turned with me, same distance. I took a second turn, sharper, half expecting to slide on the ice, and they took it too. Same gap, same steady pace. No correction, no drift, nothing that looked like a driver working a wheel on a road he didn't know. That was the part that sat wrong with me. Anybody unfamiliar with that gravel would have had to slow into those turns. He didn't slow. He just turned. That's when I reached for the CB, more out of wanting to hear another voice than anything else. I keyed it and said I had a vehicle running my bumper out on the section roads north of the highway past Milk River. Asked if anybody was out there who could tell me if that road connected back around or dead-ended, figuring even silence would be better than the sound of my own breathing. Somebody answered. Older-sounding man, tired voice, the kind you hear on that channel at all hours. I told him where I was and what I had behind me, and there was a long pause before he came back. Long enough I thought I'd lost him to the terrain. When he did come back, he didn't ask me anything else about it. He just told me to get back onto the highway the way I came, keep my speed steady, and not to look in that mirror any longer than I had to. Said it plain, like he was reading off a checklist he'd read 100 times before. I asked him what he meant, asked him if he'd seen this before, and the radio went to static mid-question. That hard, flat static that means the signal's gone, not fading, gone. I sat with the mic in my hand for a good while after that. Tried other channels, the Weather Channel, the trucker chatter that had been going earlier in the night, about the plows out past Wolf Point. Nothing. Not static exactly, just nothing. Like the radio had been switched off at the source, though the power light was still on, and everything else about the truck was running the way it should. I got myself back onto the highway, the way he said. Kept my speed even, 60. Wouldn't let myself creep up or ease off, no matter what my foot wanted to do. The lights were still there when I got back on the pavement. Same gap, holding through Malta, past the grain elevators, out into the open stretch toward Glasgow, where the land goes flat and empty again, and the sky starts to lighten up at the edges, if you know when to look for it. They were gone by the time the sun came up. I didn't see them go. I checked the mirror somewhere around 6, with the light starting to come gray over the stubble fields, and there was nothing back there but empty road, all the way to where it met the sky. I drove the rest of the way into Glasgow, with the heater running and my hands sore from how hard I'd been holding the wheel, and I didn't tell anybody what had happened, because there wasn't really anything to tell that didn't sound like a man who'd been driving too many hours through too much dark. I kept driving that route for years after, told myself plenty of stories about that night, most of them boring on purpose, because boring was easier to live with. Bad alternator throwing my mirror image. Exhaustion, playing games with distance and depth this far out, where there's nothing to judge it against. A trucker who liked his space and happened to peel off somewhere I didn't clock him doing it. I believed different ones of those stories on different nights, whichever one let me sleep. It was maybe 6 years later, at a truck stop counter outside Williston, that an old man 2 stools down started talking to nobody in particular about a drive he'd made once on the High Line, decades back by the sound of it, before I was even driving that road. He wasn't talking to me. He was talking the way old men talk at counters at 4 in the morning, half to the waitress, half to his coffee. He said something had run his bumper for 200-some miles east out of Shelby one January, never closer, never further, and how he'd stopped for gas up around Milk River, and there hadn't been a mark in the snow behind him, not one, and how he'd gotten on the radio out of pure nerves, and some fellow had told him to keep his speed steady and not look in the mirror any longer than he had to, and then the radio had gone dead as a rock straight through to sunup. I didn't say anything for a long time, long enough that the waitress had come by twice to top off my coffee I wasn't drinking. I still don't know what I would have said to him if I had spoken, or what he would have said back, because I never told him it had happened to me too, word for word, same road, same stop, same warning. I paid for my coffee and drove on, and I've thought about that counter more than I've thought about the lights themselves, because the lights, at least, I could tell myself I made up. Him, I can't explain away nearly as easy. She'd been driving I-90 through Montana for 6 years, long enough that Bozeman Pass didn't scare her the way it scared new drivers. But 6 years also meant she'd learned to trust the tired feeling in her jaw, the one that showed up around mile marker 300, no matter how much coffee she'd poured into it. That last week of October, the tired feeling came on early, somewhere past Livingston, with the pass still 30 miles out, and the wind already shoving the trailer sideways, in gusts that made her knuckles ache on the wheel. She pulled off at the Pipestone rest area a little before 11, backed into a spot away from the 2 other rigs already parked for the night, and killed the engine long enough to let the cab go quiet. 20 minutes, she told herself. Just enough to stop seeing double on the yellow line. The rest area sat in a fold of the mountains, where the wind came down off the pass and rattled the sagebrush, and past the sodium lights, everything went the flat black of no moon and no town for 50 miles either direction. She set an alarm, stayed up front in the driver's seat instead of climbing back to the sleeper, and closed her eyes. Nothing happened that night. She wants that part on the record, because it would be a better story if something had. She woke to her alarm, rubbed her face, and pulled back onto the interstate, feeling maybe 60% human, and the pass went by, the way it always did, headlights, and reflectors, and the long grade, down into Butte. It was almost 3 weeks later, same run, same stretch of road, when she saw him the first time. She wasn't tired that night, or not tired enough to blame it on later, which is a detail she keeps coming back to. She was checking her passenger side mirror the way she checked it every 90 seconds or so, an old habit from a jackknife scare years back that she'd never unlearned, and in the sliver of glass that caught the inside of the cab, back where the sleeper curtain hung tied open, there was a man sitting on the edge of the bunk, not doing anything, just sitting, the way a passenger sits on a long haul after giving up on sleep, elbows on his knees, a ball cap pulled low so she couldn't get the eyes. She didn't scream or swerve. She's driven long enough that the body doesn't panic before the mind gets a chance to check the facts. What she did was glance away, then look back to the mirror for a second read, and the mirror showed her the empty sleeper, curtain hanging still, nothing on the bunk at all. She eased onto the shoulder about a half-mile up, put it in park, and climbed back there herself with her phone flashlight going. No man, no dent in the blanket. She sat in that sleeper a full minute, pointing the light at nothing, feeling more foolish than scared, then got back behind the wheel and kept driving, because sitting still on the shoulder of Bozeman Pass in October is its own kind of dangerous. She told herself it was the kind of thing a brain builds out of 5 hours of sleep and gas station coffee, a shadow in a curtain fold, and her own mind wanting a second body in a cab that gets lonely enough to want one. She almost believed that. Then it happened again the next run-through, and the one after that. Always that same stretch. Always that same posture. Never once there when she checked directly. What actually changed her mind wasn't the third sighting. It was a phone call. She'd known Cheryl since orientation at her first company. Two women in a business that still ran mostly men, and they'd kept in touch the way drivers do, texting from truck stops, calling when the road got long enough to need another voice in the cab. She brought it up half as a joke, bracing to get laughed at. Man in the sleeper, gone the second I check. Only in one spot on I-90, coming down toward Pipestone. Cheryl didn't laugh. The line went quiet long enough that she thought the call had dropped, and then Cheryl asked, careful, whether he wore a cap, and whether he ever moved. When she said no, never moved, just sat there, Cheryl told her she'd heard nearly that same story from a driver out of Great Falls a couple years back, almost word for word, same stretch of highway. Not from Cheryl's own eyes. Second-hand, driver to driver. The way certain stretches of road build up a reputation nobody official ever writes down anywhere. That landed worse, somehow, than if Cheryl had told her she was losing it. It meant the thing in her mirror wasn't hers alone to carry. She started running her dash cam after that. The truck had a two-lens unit, one facing out the windshield, one turned back into the cab for insurance purposes, the kind every fleet had started requiring after enough lawsuits. She didn't mention it to Cheryl, just let it quietly record on the next several runs through the pass, and 4 nights later, coming down off the summit around 1 in the morning, she felt that itch on the back of her neck that had started meaning something, and didn't even check the mirror. She kept driving, hands steady, until she could pull off safe, and then she sat in the dark and scrubbed back through the footage. There were 9 seconds of it, grainy, lit only by dash glow and passing headlights, but a shape sat on the bunk that hadn't been in the frame before and wasn't in the frame after, shoulders and the suggestion of a cap, gone between one frame and the next, like a light had been switched. She watched it maybe 15 times, hands cold on the phone, feeling something she hadn't let herself feel through any of the mirror sightings, which was that this was real, in a way she could no longer talk herself out of. She plugged her phone in to charge, meaning to upload the clip the second she got signal, wanting somebody else to see it and tell her she wasn't crazy. When she woke the next afternoon at a truck stop outside Butte and went looking for it, the file had rotted into an unplayable black square, 0 seconds long, sitting right where the 9 seconds should have been. Every other clip from that same drive, before and after, played fine, only that one had gone bad overnight, and she has never explained that to her own satisfaction, camera glitch or something else, and at some point, she stopped trying. That was when she posted about it, stripped of the footage she could no longer prove, just the plain account, typed out on a trucking forum at 2 in the morning, from a parking lot in Butte, half expecting to get mocked off the page. Most replies were the kind you'd expect, jokes about coffee and black ice and imagination. One wasn't like that. An older guy, by the sound of his writing, said a driver had died of a heart attack in his cab at that exact pull-off at Pipestone, years back, found the next morning by another trucker who'd parked behind him, and figured he was only sleeping in. That explained the place. It didn't explain why he was riding with her specifically, on a truck he'd never have set foot in while he was alive, and that question sat with her for another week, before she thought to ask it out loud, to the broker who'd sold her the truck at auction a year and a half back, a man she still had in her contacts from the paperwork. She asked him, almost as an afterthought, where the truck had come from before it hit his lot. He had to dig for it, but he found the name in his old file, the previous owner-operator, the man the truck had belonged to for 11 years, before it got sold off out of an estate. It was the same name as the reply on the forum. Same first name, same last name. No room left for it to be coincidence once she'd read it twice. She never stopped at Pipestone again. She reroutes her fuel stops now, adds 20 extra minutes to that run, rather than pull in anywhere within 5 miles of that spot. And for a while, that felt like enough, like she'd found the edge of the thing and stepped back from it clean. Then, 2 months later, hauling a load through Wyoming, nowhere near Montana or Pipestone or any of it, tired at the end of a long shift, she caught his shape in the mirror again. Same posture, same cap, gone, the instant she looked back. It wasn't the place after all, or not only the place. It was the truck, and the truck was hers now, paid off, and titled in her name, and she has decided, for reasons she can't fully explain even to Cheryl, that she isn't going to sell it. The gas gauge dropped below a quarter tank somewhere past Melrose, and I did the math the way you do on a night drive in February, counting miles against the orange line, telling myself I'd stretch it to Dillon. I-15 was empty in that particular way. It gets after 10 at night in Montana winter, just my headlights and the reflectors ticking by, and every so often, a semi coming the other direction, throwing snow spray across my windshield for a second, before the road went black again. I noticed the truck maybe 20 minutes before the exit. A pickup, older model, no visible plate light, sitting back about 6 car lengths, and holding there. That's not unusual on a highway. People fall into a rhythm behind each other for miles. Nobody thinks twice. What made me actually look at my mirror a second time was that when I eased off the gas to check my speed, he eased off too. Same gap, almost exactly. I sped up 10 miles an hour to see what would happen, and the gap held again, like he was tied to my bumper with a rope I couldn't see. I told myself it was nothing. Truckers do this on empty roads sometimes. Use another set of taillights as something to stare at, so they don't fall asleep. I wanted that to be true, badly enough that I almost believed it. I took the exit for Dillon, and he took it too, and something in my stomach dropped an inch. Ruby Valley Fuel sat just off the frontage road, a little truck stop with 2 pumps and a dark building behind them, closed for the night. The kind of place that runs on card readers after 9. I pulled in because I needed the gas, and because some part of me thought a lit fuel island, cameras or not, was safer than the open highway. I watched him in my mirror the whole way in, waiting for him to keep going straight past the turnoff. He didn't. He turned in right behind me. I parked at the near pump, and my hands were already doing that thing where they don't feel like they belong to you, fumbling the card into the reader. And that's when he pulled up on my left, not 2 pumps down where there was room, not behind me, directly beside me, close enough that if I'd opened my door it would have hit his. He didn't get out. He didn't reach for a nozzle. His engine just kept running, headlights off now, cab lit faint by the pump's overhead light, and I made myself glance over once, just once, and saw that his front plate had mud smeared clean across it, thick and deliberate, the kind of mud you don't pick up by accident on pavement in February. That was the moment the whole night turned, because a man who loses track of another car by coincidence doesn't cover his plate before he does it. I didn't wait for the tank to fill. I yanked the nozzle out with maybe 6 gallons in, screwed the cap on crooked, and got back on the road going the opposite direction I'd come from, toward town, hoping the lit gas station and the idea of witnesses would be enough to make him peel off. He didn't peel off. He pulled out onto the frontage road maybe 15 seconds after me. No rush to it, like he already knew I wasn't going anywhere he couldn't follow. I made a decision right then that I've replayed 100 times since, wondering if it was smart or if I just got lucky. Instead of driving into Dillon, where there'd be people, I turned onto a county road I knew from years of coming through this valley, a back road that cuts toward Twin Bridges, figuring if he was some drunk or some bored trucker playing games, he wouldn't follow me off pavement onto gravel in the dark. He followed, gravel popping under both our tires, his headlights holding steady in my mirror for almost 2 miles. And then, all at once, they went dark. That's a different kind of fear than being followed. Being followed, at least you can see him. When his lights cut, I lost him completely. Just black behind me, and the sound of my own engine, and my own breathing, too loud in the cab. And I remember thinking, maybe he'd turned off somewhere. Maybe I'd finally shaken him. I actually let myself believe that for about 90 seconds, right up until I came around a bend, and his truck was sitting there ahead of me, off to the side near a cattle guard, engine off, lights off, waiting. He hadn't followed me on that road. He'd cut his lights and taken a turn I didn't even know existed, some spur that looped back, and put him in front of me instead of behind. A man doesn't know a back way through a valley like that unless he's driven it before, more than once, on purpose. Whatever this was, it wasn't the first time he'd thought about a road like this one. I stood on the brake and threw it in reverse hard enough that the tires spun gravel, and I got turned around and drove back the way I came faster than I should have on that surface, watching my mirror the whole time for lights that never came, which was almost worse. I pulled off into a plowed field approach about a mile up, killed my own headlights, and locked every door with the kind of frantic double-checking you do when your hands won't stop shaking. And I called 911 with the phone nearly slipping out of my grip. The dispatcher's voice was flat and steady in a way that I latched onto like a rope. She had me stay on the line, had me describe where I was, not by address, because there wasn't one, but by the cattle guard, the mile marker I'd passed on the county road, the shape of the tree line against what little sky there was. She told me to stay quiet, to keep my doors locked, to let her know the second I saw or heard anything. I sat there in the dark with the phone pressed to my ear and my heart going so hard I could feel it in my teeth, watching the field approach, waiting for a shape to come around that bend. It was maybe 4 minutes, though it felt like a lot longer, before I saw a sweep of light moving slow along the county road behind me. Not headlights aimed forward, but something handheld, a spotlight or a heavy flashlight, panning across the ditches like he was hunting for exactly where I'd pulled off. He'd cut his engine somewhere back there and was walking the road on foot, looking for me. I told the dispatcher that in a whisper that barely came out right, and she told me a deputy was 11 minutes out, and then she told me something that steadied me more than anything else could have. To stay exactly where I was, doors locked, engine off, and not to run again, because a car sitting still and dark is harder to find than one that gives itself away with movement or light. Those 11 minutes are still the longest stretch of time I've ever sat through. I watched that light sweep twice more, closer the second time, close enough that I could hear gravel under boots, and I put my hand over my own mouth without deciding to, like some part of my brain thought that would keep the sound of my breathing from carrying across 100 yards of frozen field. And then, underneath that, I finally heard it. Another engine, this one coming fast from the direction of the highway, and red and blue light broke across the snowbanks before I even saw the car. The deputy found the walking light first, and the whole thing ended faster than I expected after all that waiting. A shout, a command, the spotlight dropping to the ground, and then just quiet, with lights strobing off the snow. I stayed locked in my car until a second deputy came and knocked on my window, and I finally believed it was real and let myself cry for about a minute straight before I could even get words out. What came out over the next hour, standing wrapped in a blanket by a patrol car while they ran his information, was the part that stayed with me longer than the chase itself. He wasn't a stranger who'd picked a car at random off the interstate. He had priors, a stalking charge from 2 counties over, a protective order violation on his record from years back, involving a different woman entirely, and in the cab of his truck, they found a spiral notebook with dates and mile markers written in it, some of them going back weeks, places and times that matched routes I drove regularly, without ever once feeling watched. I never got the full picture of how long he'd had eyes on me before that night, and honestly I've stopped trying to piece it together, because every answer I imagine is worse than not knowing. They arrested him right there off that county road, and I gave my statement twice, once that night, and once a few days later when I could actually hold a pen steady enough to sign it. He's still sitting in a cell awaiting trial as far as I know, and I still drive that stretch of I-15 because it's the only road that gets me where I need to go, but I don't let my tank drop below half anymore. Not in February, not ever again. And I check my mirror now in a way I never used to, not out of habit, but because I know now exactly what it looks like when someone's holding that gap on purpose, and I never want to mistake it for nothing again. This one didn't happen to me. It happened to a guy named Russ Combs, and I only know about it because a friend of mine, a hauler named Grady Pearson, was sitting 3 stools down from him at a truck stop outside Red Lodge, Montana, the same night it happened. Russ told it raw that night, before he'd had time to clean it up into something easier to say out loud. And Grady told it to me, almost word for word, months later, both of us idling at a way station off I-90. He made me promise I'd never tell it different than how he told it to me. So that's what I'm doing. Russ ran supplies up to Cook City in the summer months. Propane, dry goods, hardware, whatever the little store up there needed that couldn't wait for the Yellowstone side of the park to open properly for the season. The only way in from the Montana side is the Beartooth Highway, US 212. And if you've never driven it, you should know it's not really a road so much as an argument with a mountain that the mountain mostly wins. Switchbacks stacked on switchbacks, no guardrail in half the places you'd want one, topping out near 11,000 feet, where the air goes thin and the wind doesn't care what month the calendar says it is. Russ had run it a few hundred times by then. He wasn't the type to spook, and Grady always made a point of saying that part first, because half the stories like this come from a guy who was already primed to see something before he saw it. Russ wasn't primed for anything. He'd driven through grizzly country, eating a sandwich, with one hand on the wheel. He'd sat behind a bull moose parked in the middle of the road for 20 minutes, without so much as raising his voice. Grady's words for him were about as easy to rattle as a fence post. It was July, late in the day, the kind of light you get up that high, where the sun's technically still up, but everything down in the valley has already gone the color of a bruise. Russ was coming up on the pull-off near Vista Point, one of the wide gravel shoulders where tourists stop to photograph the switchbacks below, and he eased off just to let a rattle in his front end settle and check a strap on the load. Nothing dramatic. He'd done the same thing at that same spot more times than he could count, engine ticking as it cooled, gravel popping under his boots, that thin cold coming off the rock that doesn't care that it's the middle of summer everywhere else. Here's the first thing that doesn't sit right, and it's the reason Grady believed him. When Russ told the story that night to the guy behind the counter and a couple other drivers who'd wandered over, he told it clean. Said he saw a bear, a big one, standing up and then coming down and running off into the trees. Said it startled him, that's all. Ordinary story, the kind that gets a nod and a, yeah, they get big up there, and everybody goes back to their coffee. It wasn't until later, once the place had mostly cleared out, and it was just him and Grady left at the counter, that Russ set his coffee down and said, quiet, that it wasn't a bear. He said he knew it wasn't a bear, and he'd told it that way the first time, because saying the true version out loud made his hands start shaking again, and he hadn't wanted an audience for that. What he told Grady was that he'd looked up from the strap and seen something come over the ridge above the pull-off, maybe 80 or 90 yards off, and it came up on two legs, not reared up the way a startled bear rocks back for a second before dropping. It came over that ridgeline walking, the way a man walks, upright and steady, long enough that Russ's first clear thought was somebody's hiking up there this late, before it dropped onto all fours in one motion, no stumble, no transition, and went over the far side of the ridge faster than anything that size had any business moving, gone into the tree line before he'd finished the thought. He grabbed the CB out of habit more than plan, since his phone had shown no bars since Red Lodge, and every driver on that road knows it, and he keyed the mic and started talking before he'd worked out what he wanted to say. Grady had a buddy running the same stretch that evening, lower down, closer to where the terrain lets a signal through, and he caught maybe 4 seconds of it. Copy, something's on the ridge. It's not a bear, it's... And then it cut, the way it does up there, the mountain just swallowing the rest of it whole. Nobody ever heard the end of that sentence. Russ never finished it out loud to anyone else either, not that night, not since. Here's where it stopped being a story about something he saw at a distance and turned into something else. Grady asked him, half joking, if he'd gotten a good enough look to call it in to Fish and Wildlife, and Russ said no, and then he said something that made Grady put his coffee down. He said that after it dropped and ran, he sat there in the cab a second, just breathing, and then, for no reason he could explain, he checked his mirrors, and his passenger side mirror, the big flat one mounted on the door, was folded back flush against the glass, not broken, not hanging loose like it had caught a branch going by. Folded back clean, the way you'd fold it in by hand to squeeze through a tight gap, except Russ hadn't touched it, and there was nothing on that shoulder, wide or close enough to have clipped it. He said it almost embarrassed to say, because a bent mirror doesn't prove a single thing, but it was the detail that kept him up that night, more than the sighting itself. Something had been close enough to touch the truck, on the side facing away from where he'd watched it go. Grady didn't make much of that part in the moment, by his own account, but about a year later, he got to talking with an older guy, retired by then, who used to run maintenance grading on 212 for the state. The pull-off near Vista Point came up sideways, nothing to do with Russ at all, just talk about rough shoulders on that stretch of highway. And the old guy mentioned, not making anything of it, that he'd always told his crews not to leave equipment parked there overnight. Not for theft, he said. There's nothing up there worth stealing. But twice in his years on that crew, he'd come back in the morning to find gear moved, a chain unhooked and laid out straight on the ground instead of coiled the way his men left it. Once a 5-gallon bucket set upright on the hood of a grader, like somebody had placed it there on purpose. He said the crew had a rule among themselves about that pull-off, never written down anywhere, about not being there past dusk. And when Grady pushed him on why, the old guy just shrugged and said everybody who works that road long enough ends up with their own reason, and they don't compare notes on it much, because comparing notes makes it real in a way that's easier to just leave alone. Russ kept running the Cook City route after that, because it was the job, and the job paid, but he changed how he ran it. He started timing every trip so he'd be off the pass and down into Red Lodge before the light started going, even if it meant leaving before dawn or eating a delivery a day behind schedule. If a storm or a breakdown ever put him at risk of finishing that drive after dark, he'd pull over wherever he was, lock the cab, and wait for morning rather than push through. He never gave anybody a real explanation for it. Not his dispatcher, not his wife, according to Grady. Just that he didn't run it after dark anymore. Full stop. And the people who knew him well enough not to push, didn't push. He held that line for 2 more summers, and then dropped the Cook City contract altogether. Took a regular haul between Billings and Laurel instead. Less money. Same hours every day. Home every night, with plenty of light still in the sky. Grady made me promise I wouldn't go looking for Russ to ask him about any of it myself, and I've kept that. But I'll tell you the last part, because it's mine, not his, and it's the reason I still think about this more than I probably should. About 8 months after Grady told me all this, I had a run that put me through Red Lodge in July, and I had daylight to spare, so I took the detour up 212. Told myself it was just to see the road everybody talks about. I stopped at that pull-off near Vista Point, the same one, because it's marked and it's where you'd naturally stop, and I sat there a few minutes with the engine off, looking at that ridge, feeling a little foolish about the whole thing. Nothing happened. No shape on the line, no sound out of place, just wind, and the kind of quiet you only get above the tree line. I got back in, and out of habit more than anything, I keyed my own CB to check the channel, before pulling out, and for about a second and a half, before I'd said a word into it, I got a burst of something back. Not static exactly, not words either, just a half-second of noise that didn't sound like the mountain eating a signal. It sounded more like the mountain sending one back. I've told myself a dozen times it was a skip, a reflection off the rock face, something with a plain explanation. I just don't happen to know. But I pulled out of that lot and made sure I was down off that pass a good hour before the lights started to go, and I haven't driven it again since. If you asked me why, I don't think I could give you a better answer than the one Russ gave everybody who ever asked him. We'd been running team for 11 years by the time it happened, Dale and me, and Highway 87 between Great Falls and Havre was about as familiar to us as our own driveway. You get to know a stretch of road that well and it stops holding any surprises. Rocky Boy sits off to the west of it, the reservation land rolling out dark and quiet past the fence line, and once you clear Box Elder, there's nothing but grass and fence posts, and the bear paws sitting low on the horizon, like something hunched down for the winter. That November night was cold enough that the diesel was thickening in the tank, and Dale had the heater running loud enough to compete with the engine. I had the log open on my knee, and channel 19 humming low, the way it always does, because you keep it on for company as much as for warnings. For the first hour it was ordinary. A reefer driver out of Havre griping about fuel prices. Somebody putting out word about black ice building up near the Marias River Bridge, which we filed away for later. A couple of guys just talking to hear their own voices, the way you do at 1 in the morning, when the miles start running together, and the radio is the only thing keeping you tethered to other human beings. Dale had his coffee wedged between his knees, and I remember thinking it was a good night, an easy night. Nothing on the road but us and the cold. Then a woman's voice came on, and it stopped every other conversation on the channel cold. She wasn't shouting. That's the thing Dale and I always come back to when we tell this. She sounded almost bored, like she'd said the same thing so many times it had worn smooth. This is on 87, mile marker 241, northbound. I'm off in the ditch. I can't get the door open. Is anybody out there? Please, is anybody out there? Then nothing. No breathing. No static tail. Just silence. Dropping back in, like she'd never spoken at all. Dale keyed up right away, gave our location, told her to stay put, said we were coming. Nothing came back. I pulled up the mileage on the dash GPS while he drove, and then again on the paper atlas we still keep behind the seat, because the GPS glitches out that far from a tower, and neither one of us could make mile marker 241 work. The markers on that stretch of 87 don't run that high. They top out well short of it before the road changes designation near Havre. I checked it twice, thinking I'd misheard her, but Dale had heard the same number, clear as anything. There wasn't a 241 to be off in a ditch at. It didn't exist. We figured it for a bad relay at first. Somebody's signal bouncing off a tower it shouldn't have, garbling the number. That was the story we told ourselves for about 4 minutes, which is how long it took for her to come back on and say the exact same thing again. Same words. Same pause after the door opened. Same flat little silence at the end. Dale keyed up and asked her straight out what she was driving. Whether she was hurt, whether she could see any other markers near her, anything that would tell us she was actually hearing what came back at her. Nothing changed. 4 minutes later, same sentence, same cadence, like a groove worn into a record. We went back and forth, calling her for another 20 minutes, and she never once answered a single thing we asked. She wasn't talking to us. She was just playing. Dale's not a nervous man. 20-some years driving, and I've seen him talk down state troopers and back a rig into a loading dock in a crosswind without breaking a sweat. But I watched him start timing her against the dash clock, and I watched his jaw set when he confirmed it landed at 4 minutes and 40 seconds every single time. Not close to it, exactly on it, down to what the clock would show us. That's not something a person does. That's not something a bad signal does either. We were maybe 15 minutes into that when another driver keyed up, a guy running south the opposite direction, somewhere up past Box Elder by his own account, which put him a good 35, 40 miles north of where we were. He asked if anybody else was hearing that gal saying 241, said it was driving him up the wall, said he'd first caught her at exactly the same run of the clock we had. Channel 19 doesn't carry that far, not on flat ground at night with towers, what they are out there. 3, maybe 5 miles on a good rig, 10 if you're lucky, and the air's doing something helpful, not 40. Whatever we were both hearing, it wasn't coming from one place, broadcasting outward, the normal way. It was just there, in both our cabs, at the same second, like it didn't have to travel to reach us at all. That's when I reached over and started running the dial, hunting for anybody at all, on the other channels, just to hear something ordinary. There's always somebody. There's always a trucker within reach, griping about a scale house, or asking about a fuel stop, or just keying up static to keep from falling asleep. That night there was nothing. Every channel I touched gave me a clean, total quiet. The kind you don't get on 19, even at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday. It wasn't the ordinary hush of an empty stretch. It felt like the whole band had been cleared out for her. Like somebody had shut a door on every other conversation in the county, so there'd be nothing left to compete with. We kept driving because there wasn't much else to do, and somewhere around the 3rd or 4th time she cycled back through, Dale glanced at the odometer out of habit, the way you do 100 times a shift without thinking about it, and he went quiet in a way I still don't have a good word for. I asked what, and he didn't answer right off, just pointed. The number on our own trip odometer, converted out to the mile marker we'd just be crossing, was close enough to 241 that it might as well have been sitting right under our wheels. Not the old number that didn't exist on any map anymore, wherever we actually were. She wasn't reciting a fixed point at all, or she never had been. She'd just been ahead of us the whole time, waiting for us to catch up to whatever spot she was measuring against. I don't know how else to say it, except that it felt less like we were listening to something, and more like something had been listening to us the whole way up that road, and had just decided to let us know it. Neither one of us talked for a long while after that. Dale kept both hands on the wheel, and I kept the radio on, because turning it off felt worse than leaving it running. We watched for the lights of Rocky Boy the way you'd watch for a shoreline, and when they finally came up out of the dark, low and orange and completely unremarkable, the channel filled back in around us like water closing over a stone. Somebody was already mid-sentence about a dot inspection outside Havre, easy as anything, like nothing had happened at all. We never heard her again that night. We didn't talk about it much for a couple months, honestly, because there wasn't a way to bring it up that didn't sound like we'd been half asleep and spooked ourselves over a bad relay. It was February, at a truck stop outside Great Falls, warming up over bad coffee with a couple of drivers we'd known for years, that it finally came up sideways, Dale mentioning the dead stretch of radio almost as a joke. One of the older guys, a driver named Purcell, who'd been running that corridor since before either of us had a license, didn't laugh. He just nodded slow and asked what mile marker she'd given. Turns out we weren't the first, and we weren't going to be the last. Purcell told us that back before the state redid 87 through there, sometime in the 80s, the mile markers ran on a different count, an older survey that got scrapped when they repaved and resurveyed the whole corridor. 241, on that old count, sat almost exactly where the road takes its long curve, past the reservation boundary. And decades back, a young woman running her first solo haul went off that curve in a whiteout and wasn't found for 3 days. Nobody we talked to could agree on her name, or point us to a news clipping, or tell us anything we could actually verify, and Purcell was upfront about that part too. Said it was just something drivers passed around, the way you pass around any story that happens often enough to enough different people that you stop being able to call it nothing. Some of the old-timers called it the echo. Nobody had ever found a transmitter, or a body of proof, or an explanation that held up past the parking lot you were standing in when you heard it. We still run that stretch. We haven't turned the radio off, and we haven't stopped keeping 19 on either, because some habits you don't break just because they scared you once. We didn't hear her again for the better part of 2 years, and I'd almost let myself believe we'd used up whatever luck or bad timing had put us in her way that one November night. Then this past fall, same month, same stretch of road, Dale swears he caught half a second of something under the static, right around mile marker 200. One syllable, gone before either of us could agree on what it was, or even whether it was a word at all. We didn't slow down to find out. We didn't talk about it after either. Some nights you just keep driving and let the road hold on to whatever it's holding on to, and you tell yourself that's the smart way to leave it. I've worked dispatch for Rocky Mountain Freight for 19 years, and I want to tell you about the one call I still hear in my sleep. Not because it was the worst wreck I've logged. It wasn't even the worst that winter. It's because I was the only person on Earth who knew, in real time, exactly how close it came to going the other way, and there was almost nothing I could do about any of it except keep my voice steady and keep him talking. His name was Dale Kessler, 58 years old, drove for us out of Butte for going on 22 years, hauling reefer loads of produce and dairy east over Homestake Pass, toward Bozeman, and on to Billings. Quiet guy. Called in every checkpoint like clockwork because that's the rule on that stretch of I-90. You radio the summit, you radio the bottom, because Homestake eats trucks alive in the winter, and everybody who runs it knows somebody who didn't walk away from it. That night, a Thursday in December, 10 days before Christmas, he checked in at the bottom of the grade at 9:52 p.m. Same as always. Sky was clear where he was. Forecast on my board said flurries after midnight. Nothing that would shut the pass. Routine. I remember writing the time down and moving on to the next board. What I didn't know yet, what I found out 4 minutes later and have never fully forgiven myself for, even though everyone tells me it wasn't my fault, was that the National Weather Service had already upgraded the pass to a ground blizzard warning at 9:41, 11 minutes before Dale even checked in. Wind-driven snow, gusts past 50, visibility dropping to 0, without a single new flake needing to fall, just what was already on the ground, getting thrown sideways off the ridgeline. That warning was supposed to route straight into our system, through the state's road condition feed. It sat in a queue instead. Some server hiccup, some update nobody tested on a Thursday night in December, and by the time it finally blinked onto my screen, Dale was already 4 miles up the grade, with a loaded trailer behind him, and nowhere flat enough to turn around. I got on the radio the second I saw it. "Dale, you copy. I need you to find a place to pull off. We've got a blizzard warning just came through." And he came back almost laughing, said, "Little late for that, Ruthie. I'm socked in already. Can't see my own hood ornament." That's when I understood. The warning hadn't failed him gently. It had failed him right at the exact moment turning back, stopped being an option. I kept him on the radio after that, just talking, the way you do, because a voice on the other end matters more than people think when the world outside your windshield turns to static. And it was in that stretch of small talk, him easing the rig down through the whiteout at 15 miles an hour with his Jake brake growling, that he said something that stopped my pen on the page. He said, "Good thing I stopped for that girl back at Whitehall. She's not loving this much either." I asked him what girl. He said a teenager, 16 maybe, standing at the exit ramp in nothing but a hoodie with her thumb out, no coat, and he wasn't going to leave a kid like that on the shoulder in December, no matter what the company handbook said about unauthorized riders. He'd have written it up in the morning. He didn't know her last name yet. Said her name was Casey. Said she was trying to get to an aunt's place in Butte. So now I wasn't tracking one life on that mountain. I was tracking 2, and one of them wasn't on any manifest, wasn't in any system, didn't officially exist to anybody but a truck driver who couldn't leave a kid standing in the cold. The whiteout took the choice out of everyone's hands. About 90 seconds later, I heard it before I understood it. A change in the engine note, a burst of static, and then Dale's voice going up an octave as he said, hang on, to nobody and everybody at once. The trailer had started to swing. On glare ice under fresh wind-packed snow, with a crosswind catching 34 feet of steel doing 15 miles an hour, there's only so much a driver can do, and Dale did all of it. Eased off, didn't brake hard, tried to steer into the skid, and it wasn't enough. I heard the impact through the radio. A flat, ugly crunch, metal folding, and then nothing. 4 seconds of nothing that felt like 4 minutes. Then his voice, shaking, but there. We're down, Ruthie." Jackknifed into the median. "I think we hit the rock cut." I asked if he could get out. Long pause. "Doors jammed." Both doors. Snow's packed against my side, and hers is bent into the frame. He was pinned in a truck he could no longer walk away from, on a mountain pass where the temperature was already 11 degrees and dropping, with a kid in the sleeper who hadn't said a word since the impact. I told him to keep the engine running for heat, standard advice, and it was Dale himself who caught the problem before I did, because he'd been driving longer than I'd been dispatching. He said the impact had crumpled the frame back by the exhaust stack, and snow was already drifting up against it fast in that wind. If the pipe packed shut with the engine running, the cab would fill with carbon monoxide before either one of them ever felt cold enough to worry about it. That's the cruelty of it that people don't understand about being stranded in a wreck like that. The thing that's supposed to save you can kill you faster than the thing you're afraid of. So Dale had to rob himself of the one heat source he had, running the engine in short bursts, cracking a window each time to be sure exhaust wasn't backing up, then shutting it down again to conserve fuel and lower the risk, sitting in the cold dark in between. That's not a decision anybody should have to keep making correctly, over and over, with a scared kid behind him, and his hands already going numb. I called it in the second the crash happened, dispatched a highway patrol and the county's rescue unit at the same time, and for about 6 minutes, I actually believed help was close. Then dispatch for the sheriff's office came back on my line, and the news was worse than I wanted. There'd been a 4-vehicle pileup 12 miles back down the grade near the Continental Divide overlook. Same storm, same road, and it had happened 40 minutes before Dale's wreck. Every plow, every tow rig, and the only ambulance based out that side of Butte were already committed there. Working injuries. Some of them serious. The nearest unit that could even attempt homestake in that whiteout was coming from Bozeman, on the far side of the very pass that was killing visibility, and their ETA when I got it made my stomach drop clean through the floor. 90 minutes, maybe more, depending on how the road looked once they got moving. 90 minutes is a long time to keep a person warm with a broken heater and a buried tailpipe. It's an eternity when that person's temperature is already sliding. Somewhere around the 40-minute mark, his radio started cutting in and out, and it took me a second to understand why. With the alternator working the battery harder than usual, engine cycling on and off, running the cab's electronics between bursts, the whole system was bleeding voltage it didn't have to spare. His voice would come through clear, then chop into static, then vanish for 10, 15 seconds at a stretch that felt like a held breath. I did the only thing I could think to do. I got on channel 19, the open CB, and I asked for anybody running homestake or close to it to relay for a driver in distress. Within 4 minutes I had 3 rigs answering, drivers who knew Dale, or knew of him, the way everybody on that circuit eventually does, and they formed up into a slow convoy behind a state plow that was inching up from the butte side, headlights strung out in a line through snow, so thick the lead driver said he was steering by feel, and mile markers alone. It wasn't official rescue. It was truckers doing for one of their own, what the system couldn't get there fast enough to do itself. And for the first time that night, I let myself believe we might actually beat the clock. It was somewhere in that stretch, digging through our system trying to find any next of kin info in case the worst happened, that I found the detail that turned my stomach over a second time that night. I ran the name Casey against the missing persons alerts that come through our regional feed, mostly out of habit, not expecting anything. And there she was, 16-year-old female, filed 3 hours earlier out of Whitehall by her mother, last seen walking away from a house on foot after an argument, no coat, exact description down to the hoodie. Her mother had already called it in before Dale ever pulled off at that exit ramp to pick her up. She wasn't just a kid hitching a ride to her aunt's. She was a girl whose mother had spent the last 3 hours believing the worst, and I had a name and a number, and no good way yet to tell her that her daughter was alive, but trapped in a wrecked truck on the coldest, most dangerous stretch of highway in the county, in a storm that was actively slowing down the people trying to reach her. By the time the convoy was 30 minutes out, Dale's voice had changed in a way I recognized from every hypothermia call I'd ever worked. And it's the sound that still gets me, even now. He'd started slurring words that should have been easy, mixing up numbers, losing his place mid-sentence, laughing at things that weren't funny. I kept him talking on purpose, made him count backward from 100 by 7s, asked him what he'd gotten his wife for Christmas. Anything to keep his brain working against the cold instead of drifting with it. Because once a person that far gone stops fighting to stay present, they stop fighting altogether. He got slower, longer gaps between words. Somewhere around mile marker 233, in the middle of a sentence about his grandkids, he just stopped. I called his name maybe 8 times into dead air. The convoy was still 11 minutes out by the plow driver's last radio check, and I remember thinking, with a kind of flat, cold clarity, that 11 minutes might be exactly the difference between getting there and getting there too late. Then the radio crackled back to life, and it wasn't Dale's voice. It was a girl's, young, scared, but steady, in a way that startled me. She said her name was Casey, said Dale had gone quiet and she couldn't wake him all the way, and she needed to know what to do. I talked her through checking his breathing, told her to keep him upright if she could, keep talking to him, even if he didn't answer, and then I asked if there was any way to signal the road from where they sat. She said there were flares in a box behind the driver's seat, the kind the company puts in every cab for breakdowns, and she'd already found them before I even asked, because she'd spent 2 winters in foster placements out past Wisdom, where the woman who ran the house had drilled her on exactly this: what to do if you're ever stuck out in weather like that. How a person can freeze without ever feeling like they're dying. How a flare held out a cracked window is sometimes the only thing standing between a search truck and driving right past you in a whiteout. She got the window down maybe 3 inches against the packed snow, fought the cold pouring in, and held that flare out into the dark for as long as her arm would let her, switching hands when one went numb. The lead plow driver saw it, said afterward it was the only thing he saw the whole climb that wasn't white. A small red bloom off to the right of the rock cut, and he about drove past it anyway before it registered as something that shouldn't be there. They got the rescue rig alongside, cut the passenger door free with a spreader bar because the frame had bent it shut for good, and pulled Casey out first, half frozen but talking, still gripping that dead flare in her fist, like she couldn't make herself let go of it. Dale came out unconscious, core temperature so low. The paramedic told me later they almost didn't believe the number on the monitor. They got him wrapped, got heat packs against his neck and chest, got him into the ambulance, and moving before his heart had a chance to decide anything on its own. He came back around in the ER a little after 4 that morning, and the first thing he did once he could form full sentences was ask if the girl was okay, before he asked anything about himself. Casey's mother made it to the hospital before sunrise, and I wasn't in the room for that. But the nurse who was told me she'd never seen a person cry like that, from relief rather than grief, and that Casey held on to her, like she was the one who'd almost lost something. Dale spent 3 days in that hospital and came out with some numbness in 2 fingers that never did come all the way back, and a story he still doesn't love to tell in bars, because people assume he's exaggerating the parts that were real. I talked to him on the phone about a week later, both of us a little raw about it, in that way you get when you've been that close to a bad ending together, without ever being in the same room. He said the last thing he remembered clearly was arguing with himself about whether to crack the window one more time. Everything after that was just her voice, telling him to stay with her, in a truck that was slowly running out of everything except a 16-year-old girl who refused to let go of a flare. She's 22 now, went through the EMT program up in Missoula 2 years back. Works search and rescue seasonal out of Gallatin County. Says the reason she signed up was that somebody once did the hardest, most inconvenient right thing for her on a highway shoulder in the cold, and she wanted to be the kind of person who does that for somebody else. Dale still runs homestake 3-4 times a month. Still checks in at the bottom of the grade every single time, same as he always did, except now, the first thing I do before I write the time down is check the radar myself, twice. Because I never again want to be the last one to know a storm already changed everything. Dale Reyes had been driving Highway 12 for 6 years, hauling freight between Billings and Miles City, and he knew this stretch the way most people know the walk from their bed to the bathroom in the dark. 40 miles either direction to anything you could call a town. Rosebud County at 11 at night in September was just headlights and fence posts, and the occasional pair of eyes glowing back at him from the ditch. Deer mostly, sometimes a coyote that didn't care enough to move. He had the radio on low, some AM station out of Miles City, playing steel guitar, and he was thinking about the diner in Forsyth that stayed open late on Thursdays when he felt it. A shudder came up through the floor of the cab, a knocking that didn't belong to any rhythm the engine made. He eased off the gas and listened. The way you listen to your own body when something hurts that's never hurt before, and the knocking got worse, turned into a grinding that he felt in his back teeth. He pulled onto the shoulder, where the gravel widened out near a cattle guard, killed the engine, and sat there a second before he grabbed his flashlight. It didn't take him long to find it. The outboard hub on the trailer's rear axle was running hot enough that he could smell it before he got close. A burnt metal smell mixed with grease that told him a bearing had gone bad, and gone bad fast. He crouched and put his hand near it, not on it, and felt the heat coming off in waves. If he'd kept driving another 5 miles, that wheel could have locked up, or worse, caught fire. So this wasn't the kind of breakdown you shrug off and wait out. This was the kind where you call it in, and you don't move the truck again until someone with the right tools tells you it's safe to. He climbed back in the cab and called dispatch, and the woman on the line, Carla, ran through it with him calm as anything. Said the closest tow with a flatbed rated for his trailer was out of Forsyth, and Forsyth was pulling double duty tonight because there'd been a rollover on the interstate. Her best guess was 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours. Dale thanked her, hung up, and sat with that number for a minute. 2 hours wasn't the end of the world. He'd waited longer in worse weather. He grabbed his jack and his light and got down to see if he could at least block the wheel and check the axle for damage while he waited. Something to do with his hands besides sit there. He was on his back, under the trailer, flashlight in his teeth, running his fingers along the axle housing, when he noticed the bars on his phone had dropped from 2 to 1. He didn't think much of it at first. Phones did that out here. The whole county was a patchwork of dead zones between towers. But he pulled it out to check the time and watched the bar blink and then vanish altogether. No service. Not spotty. Not weak. Gone. He lay there under the trailer with cold gravel biting into his shoulder blades and understood, in a way he hadn't fully let himself understand before, that if anything went wrong out here in the next hour, wrong in a way that mattered, there was no one he could call. Carla knew where he was, more or less. That would have to be enough. He went back to work because there wasn't anything else to do, and that's when he heard it. Boots on gravel. Slow. Off to his left, near the back of the trailer. Not the quick scuff of someone walking up to help, but a steady, unhurried crunch, like someone pacing something out. He froze, with his hand still on the axle, and listened. The steps kept going, tracked around behind the trailer, and stopped. He called out, "Hey, you good?" Thinking it was another driver who'd seen his hazards and pulled over, the way truckers do for each other out here. Nothing came back. No voice, no footsteps starting again. Nothing but the tick of his cooling engine and the wind moving through the grass on the other side of the fence line. He told himself it was a deer, or his own boots scraping as he shifted his weight, and he almost believed it long enough to keep working. When he finally slid out from under the trailer to stretch his back and get a look around, his flashlight beam caught the mud, just past the shoulder where the gravel gave out, and he crouched down without meaning to. There were boot prints there, a full, clear set, the tread deep and fresh, the mud still wet at the edges where it had been pressed down. That wasn't what stopped his breath. What stopped it was where they were, right where he'd been standing when he first got out of the cab, before he'd walked to the back of the trailer, before he'd started working. The prints were under the spot where his own boots had been, which meant somebody had already been standing there, close enough to touch him, before he'd even opened his toolbox. He hadn't heard anyone arrive. He hadn't seen headlights. No other vehicle on the shoulder. Nothing but his own rig, for as far as his light would carry. He stood up slow, turned in a full circle, scanning the dark past the fence line, and saw nothing but grass, moving in a wind that didn't feel like it should be strong enough to move it that much. He climbed back into the cab, told himself he'd wait it out from up there, engine off, to save what battery he had, doors locked out of habit more than fear. It was checking his side mirror, adjusting it out of pure restless nerves, that he saw the shape sitting on his rear bumper, not standing, not walking away, sitting, like he'd settled in for the weight same as Dale had, elbows on his knees, head tipped just enough that Dale couldn't make out a face in the dark, only the pale smear where one would be. Dale's hand found the door lock and pressed it down even though it was already down, and he sat there with his heart going so hard he could feel it in his throat, watching that shape in the mirror not move at all, not once, for longer than felt possible for a person to hold still. Then the handle on the driver's door clicked, turned, pulled, and let go. A pause. Then the passenger side, same slow, deliberate test. Dale had both hands on the wheel like it could do something for him, with the engine dead, and he watched the handles, through the corner of his eye, waiting for panic, for someone yanking and pounding, and it never came. Whoever it was, tried each door once, patient, like checking work, already half expected to fail, and then Dale heard boots move to the back of the cab, toward the narrow side door that led into his sleeper, the one most people who'd never driven a rig wouldn't even know was there. The handle on that one got tried too. That was the part that lodged in him deepest, worse than the bumper, worse than the footsteps. A stranger off the highway doesn't know trucks have a second door back by the bunk. Someone who tries it anyway has stood outside a cab like this before. He grabbed his CB, more out of desperate habit than hope, keyed it, and set his mile marker, said he had somebody outside his truck and no cell signal, asked if anybody was on the channel. Static answered him for a long 10 seconds, and then a voice came through, older, rough, a man who said his handle was Widowmaker and that he was hauling cattle feed out of Broadus, 40 minutes out but coming. Dale told him what was happening, and the line went quiet in a different way, a listening quiet, before the man came back and said, "Lo, you keep your doors shut, and you don't open them for anybody, not even if they say they're the tow." Dale asked him why he said it like that, and the man said there'd been a fella 2 years back, broke down near that same cattle guard, told damn near this same story to whoever'd listen after, said someone circled his rig all night, trying every door on it, and after that night, the driver quit hauling altogether. Wouldn't say why beyond that. Dale sat with the mic in his hand and realized the man wasn't warning him out of general caution. He was warning him because he'd heard this exact thing before, from someone else, on this exact road. The radio cut to static right in the middle of the old driver, telling him to keep talking, stay on the line, and no matter how many times Dale keyed the mic and said the man's handle, nothing came back but hiss. He set it down and pulled his knees up onto the seat without meaning to, made himself smaller, watched both mirrors at once until his eyes burned. At some point past 3 in the morning he saw, or thought he saw, the pale shape of a face lean into the passenger window from an angle he couldn't have caught if the person hadn't wanted him to, close enough that a breath could have fogged the glass, and gone again before he could be sure he hadn't imagined it. He didn't sleep. He didn't try. He sat with his back against the door and his eyes on the dark, until the sky out past the grass started going the color of ash, and somewhere in that graying light, the sounds outside just stopped. No footsteps, no handle tried, nothing. Like whoever it was had simply decided the night was over. The tow truck and a Rosebud County Sheriff's deputy came in together a little after 6, headlights cutting up over the rise, before Dale could hear the engines, and he'd never been so glad to see a stranger's truck in his life. He told the deputy everything, the footsteps, the boot prints under his own, the shape on the bumper, the doors, and the deputy didn't write it off the way Dale half expected him to. He walked the perimeter of the rig with Dale trailing behind him, and in the mud past the gravel shoulder, in the wet ground beyond where Dale's own prints ran back and forth to the axle, there were more, a full ring of them circling the trailer and the cab, overlapping in places like someone had walked the same loop again and again through the night, patient, unhurried, exactly like the sound Dale had heard. The deputy followed the tracks out from the truck, expecting they'd lead somewhere, to a vehicle pulled off farther down, to a break in the fence, to anything that would explain how a person got out here and got away. They didn't. The prints went maybe 60 yards out into the open range, clean and readable the whole way, in ground still soft from a rain 2 days back. And then they simply ended, in the middle of flat grassland, with no fence, no draw, no tree line, nothing close enough to reach without crossing another quarter-mile of open ground, where the mud would have kept holding a print. The deputy stood there a long moment, with his hands on his hips, looked back at the truck, looked at the empty flat, and didn't say much of anything, just wrote it down, and told Dale they'd log it, for whatever that was worth. Dale watched him write and understood, in the flat gray light of that morning, that no report was going to tell him who'd been standing in the mud, outside his sleeper door trying the handle, or how a full night's worth of tracks could walk out into open country and just quit. He got his truck fixed. He got back on the road that same week, because the loads don't wait. But he doesn't take the night runs through that stretch of Highway 12 anymore, and if a dispatcher ever tries to route him through Rosebud County after dark, he finds a reason to say no. I clocked out at the East Glacier Depot at 6:40 on a Tuesday in October, same as I had every Tuesday for 2 years running the parts route down to Choteau. 90 minutes, give or take, if the weather held. That night, it was holding fine, cold and clear, the kind of dusk where the mountains go flat and blue, and the first stars show up before the skies even finished going dark. I remember locking the back doors on the van, checking the manifest against the crates one more time out of habit, and pulling out onto 89 heading south with the heater, just starting to take the chill off my hands. I remember the elk crossing sign past the second cattle guard. I remember the radio was on a station out of Great Falls playing something with a lot of steel guitar in it. And I remember thinking I should stop and top off the tank in Browning even though the gauge still showed 3/4 full, because that's just what I did, every week. Cheap insurance against the kind of night where you don't want to be doing math on fumes. Those are real memories. I'd stake anything on them. And then the next thing I have, clean and whole, is pulling up to the gate in Choteau and seeing Dale's truck already gone from the lot, which struck me as mildly annoying because I figured he'd left before locking the North Bay like he was supposed to. I didn't think anything was wrong that night. That's the part I keep circling back to. My wife asked why I was so late, and I told her something about elk on the road and a rock slide warning near Dupuyer. Some story that came out of my mouth easy and complete, like I was just reporting the news. I ate the plate she'd left in the microwave. I watched maybe 20 minutes of television. I went to bed. Nothing about that evening felt like a whole. It felt like a slightly long Tuesday. It was Friday, doing the mileage log for payroll, when the first thing cracked open. We had to log odometer out and odometer in for insurance purposes. Nothing fancy, just 2 numbers on a carbon form. I wrote down the out number from memory of checking it that night, then went and looked at the in number from the same trip sheet, and did the division out of boredom more than anything. Miles over minutes, because the security gate at the Choteau yard stamps a time on your card whether you want it to or not. My card said 10:47 p.m. I sat there with a pencil doing that math 3 separate times, because the first 2 times it came out wrong, and wrong meant impossible, and I assumed I was the one making the mistake. I went and pulled up my phone that same night, mostly to check the timestamp on the photo I usually take of the manifest before I leave a stop, just to nail down when I'd actually clocked out. What I found instead was a text to my wife, sent at 9:12 p.m., that I did not remember typing. It said I was running behind, that there'd been elk on the road, that I'd be home soon. My own words, my own phrasing, the little half-joke I always tack on about the heater taking forever to warm up. Not a garbled message, not a single character out of place. Something in me had been awake enough, present enough, to reach for my phone and describe a version of events to my wife, with enough detail that neither of us questioned it for 3 days. I asked her, carefully, trying not to sound like I was accusing her of anything, what I'd been like when I actually walked in the door. She looked at me like it was a strange thing to ask a week later. Normal, she said. Tired, maybe a little quiet, but I'd kissed her on the forehead, like always, and asked what was in the fridge. Nothing about me had seemed wrong to the one person who'd know. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. A blackout you'd expect to leave some residue, some stumble or slurred word, or blank stare. What I was hearing was that whoever drove that van and sent that text and walked through that door had done a flawless impression of me, good enough to fool my own wife, and I had no memory of being him. I called the shop the following Monday and asked if they still had the GPS pull from the van for that Tuesday, since the company had put trackers in the fleet the year before, after somebody's van got stolen out of a motel lot in Havre. My supervisor, Kip, didn't think much of the request, just pulled the report and read it back to me over the phone like he was reading a grocery list. Left East Glacier, 6:44 p.m., normal speed through Browning. Then the van sits still for 1 hour and 51 minutes at a pullout just south of mile marker 211. Engine running the whole time, no doors logged open or closed. Then it starts moving again, normal speed, all the way into Choteau. Kip asked if I'd pulled over to nap. I told him probably. Yeah, must have been more tired than I thought. It was the easiest lie available, and I took it. I drove out to that pullout myself on a Saturday a few weeks later, in full daylight, just to stand there and look at it. It's nothing. Gravel shoulder wide enough for 2 trucks, a rusted barrel for trash, a view of the front range that any tourist would stop for. No fence cut, no tire tracks that meant anything. No reason a man would sit there with his engine running for close to 2 hours, except that he wanted to look at mountains, which I have never once wanted badly enough to burn that much daylight doing it. I stood there a long time anyway. On the drive home, I emptied my wallet looking for gas receipts to reconcile my own expense report, and found one from a Sinclair station in Browning, time-stamped 8:56 p.m., that same Tuesday, a full tank, paid on my card. I never buy gas in Browning. I fill up in East Glacier before I leave, every week, because the price is better, and because that's just the habit I built the route around. The van's own log showed 3/4 of a tank when I clocked out. I had, at some point in that missing stretch, driven off my route, into a town, decided a 3/4 tank wasn't good enough, and paid to fill it anyway. That receipt sat in a drawer for a while, before I looked at it again, closely enough to notice the signature. It's mine. Anybody would tell you it's mine. But it leans a little more than I lean. The letter's coming faster. Like whoever signed it was in more of a hurry than I ever am, standing at a gas pump, making small talk with the register kid. Small enough that I could talk myself out of it most days. Not small enough that I ever fully did. I started thinking about seizures, about those small ones people have without falling down, the kind where you keep walking and talking and functioning, and just don't lay down any memory of it afterward. I made an appointment. I told the doctor everything. The log, the text, the gas station, all of it. Feeling like an idiot the whole time I was saying it out loud, in that fluorescent little room. They ran what they run. EEG, a scan, blood work checking for anything metabolic. All of it came back clean, which the doctor told me almost apologetically, like she'd have preferred to find something, because a diagnosis is at least a shape you can hold on to. She said what I was describing didn't fit the seizure pattern she'd expect, and it didn't fit a fugue state either, since those usually involve a person not coming home, not returning to the exact rhythms of their own life with that kind of precision. She didn't have a name for it. She said that plainly, without hedging, and something about her being willing to just say she didn't know was worse than if she'd made something up. I started searching for the mile marker online late at night, after my wife had gone to bed, typing in different combinations of Highway 89, missing time, East Glacier, half expecting nothing, and half afraid of what I'd find if there was something. There's a forum for long-haul and regional drivers, mostly complaints about dispatch and fuel cards. Buried pretty deep in it, a thread from 4 years back, a guy hauling propane who described almost the same thing, a stretch of that road near Dupuyere, arriving hours later than his log should have allowed, no memory of the gap, a receipt in his pocket for a stop he swore he never made. A few replies under it from other names, vague, unwilling to commit to specifics, one of them just writing that it had happened to his brother too, and that his brother didn't like to talk about it. The thread went quiet after that. A couple of the replies were gone the next time I checked, like someone had thought better of leaving them up. It was this past spring that the last piece landed, and it landed on me, instead of coming from any searching I did. We'd hired a kid, 22, running the same East Glacier route now, that I'd moved up to dispatch. He came and found me in the yard on a Thursday afternoon, not saying much at first, just standing there, with his hands in his jacket pockets, until I asked what was wrong. He told me he'd gotten in almost 4 hours late 2 nights before, couldn't account for a stretch of it, found a receipt in his truck for a stop he didn't remember making. He said one of the older drivers had mentioned, half joking, that I'd had something like that happen to me once too, and asked if that was true, and asked if I knew what it was. I didn't have anything to give him except the truth, which is that I still don't know, that the road is still there, and still gets driven every week regardless, and that the only thing that's changed since that October is which one of us is standing in the yard, telling somebody else it happened to him first. She had been driving since Bismarck, and by the time the sign for Highway 200 flashed past, circle, 40 miles, her eyes had started doing that thing where the white lines blur together and jump. She knew the signs. She'd driven tired before, and she knew the difference between tired and dangerous, and she was closing in on dangerous. When the reflective sign for the rest area came up out of the dark, she took the exit before she'd even finished deciding to. The gate at the entrance had a sign bolted to it, faded from years of sun, closed for the season. But the gate itself was swung open, propped with a chunk of asphalt somebody had kicked loose from the shoulder. She didn't think much of it. People prop gates open out here all the time. Hunters, ranchers, truckers who don't feel like backing out onto an empty highway at midnight. She pulled in slow, gravel popping under the tires, and there, parked near the picnic shelter, sat one other car. Dark, engine off, Windows fogged just enough to tell someone was sleeping in it too. She felt something in her chest loosen at the sight of it. Not alone. That was enough. She backed into a spot near the restroom block, close enough to the other car that she could see its shape in her mirror. And she locked every door twice, checking the little button even though she'd already heard it click. She texted her sister, made it to a rest stop outside Circle. Sleeping here a few hours. We'll call in the morning. And she watched the 3 dots appear and disappear before her sister just sent back a thumbs up emoji, already half asleep herself. She reclined the seat 2 inches, pulled her hoodie up, and let the hum of the highway a quarter-mile off lull her under. She woke to a sound that didn't belong in a dream. Not a bang, not a slam. Something quieter and worse. A hand, testing the driver's side handle. Once. A pause. Then the passenger handle. Same slow pressure, like someone checking a door they already expected to be locked. Patient about it, in no hurry at all. She lay still, with her eyes barely open, heart going hard enough that she could feel it in her teeth. And she waited for the sound to be nothing. A lost trucker, a drunk looking for his own car. But it came again, this time at the rear door. That same unhurried testing. And she understood, in her stomach before her brain caught up, that this wasn't someone confused about which car was theirs. Her eyes went to the mirror, out of pure animal instinct, looking for the other car, the one that had made her feel safe enough to fall asleep in the first place. It was gone. Not driving away gone, not headlights in the distance gone, just gone. An empty rectangle of gravel where it had been, and she had heard nothing. No engine turning over, no tires on the loose rock. She'd been asleep for 2 hours according to the dash clock, and somewhere in that stretch a car had come and gone 3 feet from her, and she hadn't so much as stirred. That scared her worse than the handles had. She fumbled the phone up from the cup holder, thumb shaking, and dialed 911. 1 bar. The call connected, rang once, and dropped into silence. Call failed, and when she tried again, it wouldn't even ring, just sat there searching. She was in one of those pockets, the mountains, and the distance, carved out of eastern Montana, where you could stand in the wrong spot for a mile, in either direction, and lose everything. She switched to texting instead, some half-remembered fact that texts sometimes crawl through on a signal too weak to hold a call, and she started typing to her sister. Someone is at my car. Rest area off 200 near Circle. Call police. When the shape came up outside the passenger window, it wasn't quick. That was the part that stayed with her. It didn't lunge or bang on the glass. It just stood there, a shoulder and the side of a head lit faint blue by her dashboard, close enough that she could hear breathing through the window seal, and it looked in at her without moving for what felt like a full minute. She didn't scream. Something older than thought told her that screaming was for when it was already too late, and that stillness was the only card she had left to play. She kept her thumb moving on the phone screen without looking down at it, sending the message half-finished, and she watched the shape through her lashes, pretending to be asleep, pretending to be nothing worth the trouble. Then it moved off toward the front of the car. She heard footsteps circle the hood, slow on the gravel, and she braced for the windshield to crack, for a tire iron, for anything. And instead she heard a soft sound, paper against glass, something being tucked under the wiper blade. Then the footsteps kept going, away from her, out past the edge of the lot toward the tree line, unhurried the whole time, like a man walking home from a job. She sat frozen for a long time after that, watching the dark past the picnic shelter, and then headlights bloomed to life out where the trees started. A pickup she hadn't even clocked as a vehicle, backed in tail first against the brush, the way you'd park if you didn't want your plate seen from the lot. It pulled out slow, no hurry, and rolled past the closed sign and back onto 200 heading west, taillights shrinking, and then the rest area was just her and the bug zapper hum of the sodium light over the restrooms and her own breathing loud in her ears. She gave it 10 more minutes before she trusted her hands enough to move. When she finally leaned over and looked up through the windshield at whatever had been left there, she expected a threat, a note telling her what he'd have done if she'd woken up, something meant to be found after. Instead, it was a single folded piece of paper, damp at one corner from the grass. And when she got the nerve to crack her door and grab it, the handwriting inside was blunt pencil, block letters, like someone who didn't write things down often. Don't sleep here. Not safe. Gas station in Circle is open all night. Go now. It took her a full minute to understand that the man testing her handles and the man who'd left that note weren't necessarily the same man at all, that there might have been two of them in that lot with her the whole time, one circling her car and one watching from somewhere she couldn't see, and that the truck driving off wasn't the threat leaving, it was a witness leaving, someone who'd seen something happening and chosen paper over a phone call, because whatever his reasons were, involving the police wasn't a door he wanted to walk through. The thought made the hair on her arms stand up worse than the handles had, because now the dark around her had two people in it instead of one, and she had no idea where either of them actually was. She caught the second one almost by accident, throwing the car into reverse too fast, headlights swinging across the restroom block, a shape near the corner of the building, still, watching her the way you'd watch something you didn't want to spook. It didn't move toward her. It just stood there as she straightened the wheel and hit the gas harder than she needed to. Gravel spraying. And in the mirror, she watched it stay exactly where it was, getting smaller, not following. She got her call through 2 miles down 200, signal crawling back as the road climbed out of the river bottom, and the dispatcher kept her talking the whole way into Circle. Stay on the highway, stay at speed, don't stop for anything. A deputy's already rolling. She pulled into the gas station on the edge of town, with her hands still shaking too hard to get the gear shift into park on the first try, and the deputy was there inside of 11 minutes, lights off, just pulling in quiet, and stepping out with a flashlight, and a notepad, and the kind of calm that told her he'd done this exact conversation before. He took her through it twice, wrote down the plate she'd half caught on the pickup, bagged the note into a paper evidence sleeve without much comment, and it was only after she asked him straight out, "Has this happened before out there?" that he set the notepad down on the hood of her car and told her the truth instead of the department version. 2 years back, a woman had been assaulted at that same rest area, dragged from her car in almost the same spot, and the case had never closed, the man never caught. The county had been trying to get the funding pushed through to shut the site down permanently ever since. Weld the gate, pull the picnic tables, redirect drivers to the truck stop 8 miles up. But paperwork like that moves slow when nobody with a badge is the one bleeding for it. And so the gate had sat there for 2 years, with a sign nobody enforced, and a rock holding it open for anyone who wanted in. He told her about the notes, too, when she asked, almost embarrassed to ask it. They'd found 2 others like it over the past year, tucked under wipers of cars belonging to women who'd reported something at that rest area and driven off before anything worse happened. Same block handwriting, same blunt warning, never a name. Best guess in the department was a regular, a long-haul driver, who used that stretch of 200, often enough to have seen the first assault's aftermath, or heard about it on the CB, and who'd taken it on himself to watch the lot some nights without ever wanting to be the one giving a statement in a courtroom. Nobody had tracked him down. Nobody was trying that hard to. 3 weeks later, she drove that stretch of 200 again, on her way back north, and this time, when the rest area came up in her headlights, the gate was gone. Not propped, not open, just gone, replaced by a chain-link fence stretched taut across the entrance, with a padlock the size of her fist, and a new sign, sun not yet faded, that said closed permanently. She didn't slow down. She didn't need to. She just watched it pass in the mirror, small, and then smaller, and kept driving toward the truck stop, 8 miles up the road, where the lights stayed on all night, and the lot was never empty enough for anyone to test a door unheard. The rider who was never there. He had driven Highway 2 for 11 years, and in all that time, he had never once stopped for a hitchhiker. Not in July, when the heat came up off the blacktop in waves, and you could spot a man dying of thirst from a mile off. Not in January, when the wind came down off the High Line, hard enough to shove a loaded trailer sideways on black ice. He kept the rule quietly, the way some men keep a promise to somebody who isn't around to ask about it anymore. And for 11 years, nobody ever had to ask him why. The rule went back to his second year hauling freight, long before he had his own truck and his own route. Early spring, same as now, a foggy pre-dawn run into Havre. He'd seen a kid standing on the shoulder about 4 miles outside town, thumb out, hunched against the cold, and he'd done the arithmetic every driver does at 5 in the morning, the schedule, the company policy, the stranger factor, and he'd kept his foot on the gas, told himself somebody else would stop. 2 days later, he heard, secondhand, over coffee at a truck stop, that county road crews had pulled a body out of the borrow ditch a few miles past that spot. Exposure. A kid, 19 or 20. Nobody ever knew Rich, or later just he, had been the one who passed him. He never told anybody. He just made the rule that morning, with his hand still shaking on the wheel, and he never broke it again. Until this particular morning. He was coming back empty from a machine parts drop near Malta, running the stretch of Highway 2 toward Chinook before first light, and the fog had come in low and wet, the way it does in early spring, when the ground is still cold enough to fight the air. His high beams just threw the light back at him, so he dropped to low beams and slowed down, watching the white line more than the road. The dash read 34 degrees. The wipers dragged a thin film of mist back and forth, without really clearing it. That was when he saw the kid. He was standing on the shoulder near mile marker 117, hands in the pockets of a jacket too thin for the weather, and there was nothing behind him. No headlights for the last 20 minutes. No side road for miles that could have put a car there. No fence gap. Nothing but flat stubble fields with old snow crusted in the low spots. There was no way a person should have been standing in that exact spot, and something about that wrongness reached straight down into the guilt he'd been carrying for 11 years and pulled it up by the root. His foot came off the gas before he'd decided anything. He braked, pulled onto the shoulder, and popped the door. The kid climbed up without much of a word, just a nod and a quiet thanks, and pulled the door shut behind him. He was young, maybe 19, with the kind of stillness that made him seem older. He asked if the kid was headed into Chinook. Got a nod. He asked what happened to his car. The kid looked out the windshield and said, "Wasn't in a car," in a voice so flat it didn't invite a follow-up. And he let it go, chalked it up to nerves or embarrassment, the kind of thing you don't push on a stranger at 5 in the morning. A few miles on, he noticed the kid wasn't shivering, not even a little, not the full-body shudder you'd expect from someone standing out in 34-degree fog for who knows how long. He reached over and bumped the heater up a notch anyway. The kid said he was fine. Then, almost under his breath, added, "Don't feel it much anymore," and turned to look out the side window, and he figured the kid meant he'd been out there so long the cold had gone past hurting into numb, and didn't think much more of it right then. Except the cab wasn't holding heat right. He caught himself fogging when he breathed, but only when he glanced toward the passenger side, like there was a window cracked over there, though every window was shut tight. He reached over and checked the vents on that side. Felt for a draft along the door seal, found nothing. The heater core was fine. He could feel it working on his own legs. It was just cold on that side of the cab. A specific, located cold, like somebody had left a bag of ice on the floorboard. He tried to talk it off, made some comment about how a person shouldn't be out walking this stretch this time of year, how it wasn't safe. The kid didn't answer that directly. Instead, he said, quiet and even, not looking over, "You passed somebody out here before, didn't you?" Not a question, really. His hands went cold on the wheel in a way that had nothing to do with the heater. He asked what made the kid say that. The kid didn't answer, just kept watching the road unspool through the fog. And he told himself it was a lucky guess, a small-talk stab that happened to land. And he didn't ask again, because some part of him didn't want the answer confirmed out loud. A little further on, they passed a weathered wooden cross, wired to a fence post. Sun-bleached plastic flowers zip-tied to the crossbar, the kind of roadside marker you drive past 1,000 times without registering. He'd passed that same marker more times than he could count. This time, the kid turned all the way around in his seat to watch it in the side mirror. As it faded back into the gray, held the look a long beat, and said, almost to himself, nobody ever moved it. His chest went tight, because that marker was close enough to the spot from his own memory that it could have been the same 4 miles. He reached for the CB, wanting noise, wanting another voice in the cab besides the two of them. Right as they cleared the bend past the marker, every preset went to static at once, a hard wall of white noise that hadn't been there 30 seconds earlier. He worked the dial anyway, and when a signal finally came back, faint under the hiss, it was an AM station, running some old song from years back, the kind of thing that catches you off guard for no reason you can name. He clicked it off, and drove in silence after that. He grabbed the thermos off the dash, poured a cup, and held it out to the kid without really thinking about it. Just an offer, something to warm his hands. Their fingers brushed, passing it over. The kid's hand was ice, stiff, like gripping a cold pipe left out overnight. Nothing like skin. The kid pulled his hand back fast, muttered something about always running cold, and didn't take the cup after all. He kept his eyes on the road and didn't say anything, but his stomach had dropped somewhere around his boots. Not long after, he glanced at the rear view to check his trailer lights, a habit as old as the job itself, and for half a second, the reflection of the passenger seat read empty in the mirror's angle. Nothing but upholstery and the gray window behind it. He whipped his head around to look directly, and the kid was right there, same as always, staring forward, hands in his lap. He blamed it on the fog, the hour, too many gas station coffees on an empty stomach, and told himself to keep it together. They were almost into town. The grain elevators of Chinook were just starting to show through the fog, tall gray shapes standing up out of nothing, and he opened his mouth to say something about it, almost there, glanced over mid-sentence to see if the kid had noticed them too, and the seat was empty. The seatbelt was still buckled, lying flat and undisturbed across the cushion, like it had never been unclipped. The door handle was down, locked, no click, no rush of cold air, no sound at all. The window on that side still had the same thin film of condensation it had carried the whole drive, unbroken, unwiped, nothing dragged through it by a hand or a sleeve. He hit the brakes hard enough to lock the trailer up a little, fishtailed onto the shoulder, and sat there with the engine running and his hands shaking too bad to put it in park right the first time. He got out and walked a full circle around the truck in the fog, checked the ditch on both sides, found nothing. No footprints in the frost-softened mud along the shoulder. No sign anybody had ever gotten out. He drove the last stretch into Chinook white-knuckled, pulled into the truck stop off the highway, and stood at the pump with his hands too unsteady to get the nozzle seated right the first try. Inside, the guy behind the counter, an older man he'd nodded to 100 times over the years, took one look at his face and asked if he was all right. He told him, trying to keep his voice level, trying to make it sound like less than it was. The counter guy didn't laugh it off. He went quiet instead, set down the coffee pot, and asked exactly where he'd picked the kid up. When he said mile marker 117, the older man's face changed in a way that told him this wasn't the first time he'd heard something like it. "You're not the first one this year," he said, low, like he didn't want it carrying to the two other guys at the counter. He said it happens every so often along that stretch. Always the same kind of kid. Quiet, thin jacket, never says much, always gets in without any trouble, and always ends up gone somewhere between there and town with the doors still locked. Some drivers never say anything about it to anybody. Some stop running that route at all. He asked, because he had to, if anybody knew who the kid actually was. The old man wiped the counter without needing to, and told him what he'd heard over the years, the way these things get passed around a small town, until nobody's sure anymore where the story started. A hitchhiker, decades back now, had died of exposure in the ditch, out past that same marker, one bad foggy morning when nobody had stopped for him. The old man didn't have an exact date, just a season, early spring, and when he said it out loud, something in the back of his mind lined it up, quiet and cold, against a morning he'd never told anybody about, 11 years gone. He didn't say anything about that part. He just paid for his coffee and drove the rest of his route in silence. He still runs that stretch of Highway 2, same as always, same hours, same schedule. He never picks up another rider again, not once, not in any weather. But on the mornings, when the fog sits low and wet over the fields past mile marker 117, he finds himself watching the shoulder a little longer than the road needs, half hoping and half dreading he'll see somebody standing there again. Most mornings, there's nothing but stubble and old snow. Some mornings, for a second, before the gray swallows it back up, he isn't sure.